You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone, and Happy New Year. Can't believe it is 2025 already. Well, we missed you in the few weeks that we were gone there. Hope you missed us too. I mean, what could possibly be more interesting in your weekly schedule than listening to a Bible nerd monologue for over an hour about random Bible nerdiness, right? Well, we are deviating from that a little bit here this week, so don't worry. We are returning to our topic of discussion from last January, and that is spiritual abuse. I realize that's a really heavy topic to start the year off with, but the reason we do that is because January is considered to be Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month, and spiritual abuse is not something that I think enough people are aware of. In the culture we live in today, we have started to make more common discussions on physical abuse or sexual abuse, sometimes even emotional abuse. And we're starting to get a little bit more people talking about spiritual abuse, but it doesn't have the same momentum that some of the other conversations raising awareness about abuse have. So I just like to take a couple of weeks each January to focus on this uncomfortable topic, because spiritual abuse is real and it happens all over the world in religious environments every single week. And a lot of times it's unintentional and it can more easily fly under the radar than some forms of physical abuse. So with conversations like this, we want to be able to raise your awareness of what spiritual abuse is so that you can have a healthier spiritual walk. And if you're interested in some more of the basics of what spiritual abuse is and why we find it so important to talk about, we discussed some of that last year, both in some shorts that we did in January on our social media and in the couple episodes we had with Eric Skorzynski and our friends the Nobiles over at Finding Normal podcast. Well, this year we have on a couple of new guests to talk with about spiritual abuse, and you are already reaping the benefits of my going to Theology Beer Camp this past fall. Because this week and next week, we are talking with some people that I met for the first time at Theology Beer Camp. Now, we'll worry about next week's speaker when that time comes. I'll leave you on a little bit of a cliffhanger there. But this week, we are doing a crossover with the REVcovery podcast. And I will be honest with you, I had not heard of REVcovery until Theology Beer Camp. And I saw their name flown around as one of the sponsored God pods, going on there. And I got a chance to talk with Sarah Heath, who's one of the co-hosts there. Justin Gentry, the other co-host, he was not at Beer Camp, so I didn't get a chance to meet him in person. But Sarah and I talked just briefly, and I was really intrigued by the little bit that I heard of their podcast. So when I went back home, I started listening to it. And I've really enjoyed what I have listened to of REVcovery so far. They have roughly 100 episodes, so despite how many podcasts I listened to in a year's time, I have not quite made it through all their episodes yet, but that's definitely a goal for 2025 for me. And I would totally recommend that you check out their podcast as well. It's REVcovery, REVcovery, which is really creative because both Justin and Sarah have been in full-time ministry before. Their jobs and capacities as spiritual leaders have changed over the years, and they have both had instances where they had to walk away from church situations that had a mix of good and bad going on, and they talk about all that in their podcast. But the reason I'm doing this little intro right here is because this episode is going to sound a little bit different than some of our others. Just the way it ended up working out, I basically became a guest on their podcast. So Sarah jumps right in and pretty much just starts introducing me for their audience. And you all already know me, but you don't know them. So I just wanted to take a minute, give you the little bit of background on how we connected and why I think this is a really important conversation. Justin and Sarah were fun people to talk to, and they had some really good insights based on their experiences that they've had in full-time ministry. One other note I want to give you all before we actually get into the episode here, and that's that you'll relatively quickly notice Justin and Sarah come from a progressive branch of Christianity, and they're very open about that. And I realize that our audience is very diverse in spiritual background and where they are at this point. We have people on a very conservative wing, we have people on a very progressive wing, we have people that might not even consider themselves Christian right now, or just are somewhere in between, or who knows where. Spiritual journeys are messy. And we have too much in the world today of echo chambers where we just listen to the people who sound exactly like us and give us confirmation bias of what we already believe. And I don't want this podcast to ever be that. So if you particularly come from a more conservative side of Christianity right now, you might get a little uncomfortable with some of what Justin and Sarah talk about and focus on as important to them in their Christianity. And I just want to say that's okay. I would encourage you, even if you do find yourself a little on edge with some of what they talk about, that's totally okay to sit in that. Don't feel like you have to turn off the podcast and only go listen to people that you completely agree with. I went into this knowing that Justin and Sarah are in a very different place than some of our listeners. But again, we have a very broad listenership. So even if you find yourself a little uncomfortable with it, I would encourage you keep listening because what they have to share is important and it's helpful. And what we need in American Christianity right now is not more of people who think exactly like we do. We need to be willing to broaden our circles of who we listen to. Information is never bad. Other perspectives are never bad. And you don't have to agree with everything someone else says, but it's not ever going to hurt you to learn a little bit about someone from a different side of the aisle than you are on. So I enjoyed this conversation. I hope you will too. And please be sure to go check out Justin and Sarah's podcast, REVcovery. I'll put a link to it in our show notes on the website. All right, let's get into the episode.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of REVcovery. I'm Sarah Heath with my co-host.
This is Justin, and I am here and happy to be here.
I think it's important for me to say this is Justin, who has a tagline. I don't even know if he knows he has a tagline on this current recording that says, "Pile of sentient stardust."
Yes, I added that randomly one day. It's a true statement.
It is a true statement.
But it's a little cheeky, so I like it.
That's you. He's true, but he's cheeky. Today, we are so excited to introduce to our audience, Colin. We're kind of like doing what do you want to call it? Like a crossover show.
Yeah.
So Colin, tell us a little bit
event
about yourself, about your podcast, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to be here with you both. Thank you, Sarah and Justin, for having me on. I am the host of the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered podcast. And our line that we say with that is that we try to create a healing space to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. So I am a history nerd. I'm a Bible nerd. I like to share a lot of the ancient Near Eastern history, just talking about the really nerdy stuff that you don't normally hear in a sermon because, well, it doesn't exactly make for good preaching, but it does help you to understand the Bible. And I had grown up in independent fundamental Baptist circles, very, very fundamentalist.
Sounds very light, easy peasy.
Right. No, very, very literalistic reading of the Bible, heavy on standards, all of that. And I've been on a faith journey in the last several years, and the podcast kind of is there for what I wish someone would have told me 5+ years ago. So, I try to address it not to liberal Christians, not to conservative Christians, but just to anyone where they're at that wants to learn more about the Bible and get down to what it would have meant in its culture.
I love that. So you grew up, we got to ask, you knew we were going to ask. So we usually say, how long were you in for and what were you in for? So tell us about your church journey, kind of how that's rolled into what you're doing now. And share a little bit about how you got to be this person who's willing to talk about the history and Bible.
You mean that's not normal? People don't do that with their free time?
I mean, I'm mainline. We do it all the time.
I do too, but...
If this is the focus group, we skew it a little too far over.
Yeah.
I grew up in church from a really young age. We were in an independent fundamental Baptist church, one church pretty much the whole time growing up, a couple when I was really young, but this one home church that I had in New Jersey. I grew up just across from Philly. And I was the golden child there. I was the preacher boy from a very young age. I was pushed into, you are going to be a pastor, and probably even eventually pastor that church, which was a decent sized church, anywhere from 250 to 500, depending on the year. And so I was in one of these, every time the doors are open kind of thing, and then some. Like, we laughed at the people that were there Sundays and Wednesdays. We're like, oh, that's all you do? we go for everything.
Whoa.
I have a very fundamentalist family.
And then there's the Lilies and Poinsettia crowd.
The
That's
lilies
amazing.
in poinsettia crowd? I've never heard of that.
Yeah, they're just the Easter and Christmas folks.
And Christmas, yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, we called them Creasters, Christmas and Easter. But yeah.
Lily and poinsettia. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to steal that one.
Go for
But
it.
yeah, that all led me into Bible college, which was a very conservative fundamentalist school. Got my degree in pastoral ministry, unaccredited, of course.
Love that.
Like that, of
Love
course.
that.
Yes, of course. I'm guessing the listeners of your show can relate to that a good bit.
Mhm.
And came back actually to the same church that I had grown up in. I had plans to be on staff, probably eventually take it over pastoring. And there were some issues of spiritual abuse, not to mention just my own faith journey was taking me a different path and it didn't quite line up. So at that time, I had been teaching a Sunday school class. I really like it. Again, I'm a Bible nerd. That's what I do for fun. So I was like, look, if I'm not teaching the class, I'm still doing this study just because it's the stuff I like. So the podcast actually started for our Sunday school class. I said, hey, if you all have liked what you heard, I'm going to keep putting out content. And now it has grown to where, the majority of our listeners are people I've never even met all around the country. So yeah, how long was I in for? Basically my whole life. And I just recently got out within the last 2 years.
Yeah, so you were professional. I mean, in that you went to school for it.
Yeah.
We always joke that we were professional Christians.
Yep.
Yeah.
I basically did everything at the church aside from pastor. Like I had been interns. Yeah, I'd worked with the youth, with the kids.
Yeah.
Ran the VBS 1 year.
Unpaid internship, unaccredited education.
Yeah, I will say they did actually pay for my internships, which was nice. Better than most.
Look at that.
Yeah.
What are you here for?
Yeah.
Right.
You got $13K probably for.
Whoa.
It is interesting how it starts very innocently. Like, oh, I want to serve. I want to do it. Like, oh, okay. Yeah. Well, can you do this for free? Can you do that for free? We're just gonna. We're just gonna get you kind of used to maybe what would be expected for you if we would pay you. And a lot of people just stay there for way longer than they should. And it's not just a church problem. There's plenty of unpaid internships, but I feel like it's uniquely a problem in church spaces because it's like, well, this is for the Lord. So it kind of adds that extra layer to it.
Yep. I remember hearing growing up, give the devil an inch and he'll take a mile. So you know what? Sometimes you give the church an inch and he'll take a mile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You tell them that you like to sing and you're in the choir for the next 10 years.
And then you're the choir director and then you're directing VBS. And it's hard because it's a volunteer run organization, usually somewhat. And so it's hard because to do all the things, there does need to be volunteerism, but it is, people burn out, man. Like it is wild. I don't know if you guys feel this way, but I think we're in a time when it is really difficult for church to do church without kind of taking advantage with because there's not as many people that have the free time because we don't have free time anymore for a lot of reasons. I think the little computers that we carry around in our pockets is part of it. We're never away from work. I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't have the free time we once had. And I think that we're seeing that play into churches having to, in some ways, take advantage of the people who do show up and who do show a little spark of like, oh yeah, I can do that. And then all of a sudden, the next thing they know, they're running everything.
Yeah. And it also feels good to be asked. It feels good when they're like, oh, you have a good singing voice. Or the catnip for me was like, you're a leader,
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I am. Yeah. And it's that feels good. And so people get into that feeling very good about that. And then it can, not always, but it can oftentimes turn really ugly and kind of stray into being taken advantage of or just being manipulated into doing things like I never signed up for this but I'm in it now, and then that kind of like sunk cost fallacy starts taking a hold. You're like, well, I've been in ministry this long, let's just see it through, and then it kind of snowballs from there for sure.
Yeah. What was the thing, do you think, that started to make you want to step away from being you said you were pastor boy. I'm imagining little you in a suit as a kid.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Suit and tie.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
What made you step away from that and into, what made you question whether you were preacher boy or not?
It was a very complicated journey because, going to such a conservative school, I wasn't surrounded by,
when I say conservative, it was King James only, kind of conservative, like very niche. And yet it was still a little bit broader than the circles I had grown up in. So even though it was still a very Baptist college, I'm seeing these people who are slight variations of Baptists. And it gave me just enough room to start to ask questions and reprocess, feel safe in it, feel like I wasn't being attacked by the professors or anything, like I was actually the one doing the questioning. But even then, I still thought I could stay in full-time ministry. And, naive me was thinking, I can be like the Martin Luther of fundamentalism and, revive this whole thing, reform it from the inside out. And
singing my song.
Yeah.
Oh.
You guys, I'm sure, know Pete and Jared over at Bible for Normal People. I remember listening to an episode where Pete, or something that they put out, where Pete said one time, you can live like that and try to find people who agree with you, where you're like being the real version of yourself around them while you're still being who the old church people think that you are. And you can do that for a while, but the longer you do it, the more you're going to start to ask yourself, why can't I feel the way I feel with the people I'm myself around all the time?
Yeah.
And once you ask that question, you're doomed, because you're going to eventually go down that path. And so that's kind of what happened for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've always thought outside of the box. I've always kind of been on the outside of things where I didn't fully fit in. And so I'm going, man, is this what I want, or is this what I was told I wanted? Or really that God wanted for me? And is there a way I can do this that better fits what I want to accomplish? And I think that's where the podcast came in. Is I said, there are people out there who want to, like, if I stay where I'm at, I'm going to be pulling teeth for years, going up 3 feet, going back 4, just to make some progress. And I said, there are people out there that are in the same boat I'm in. I just need to find them, which then, it's a pain starting over again. But I felt like that was the most honest thing I could do to myself and everyone listening, is just, find the community that wants to hear where I'm at instead of where they've been for so long.
Yeah.
I think Sarah and I both are like, yeah, I feel that. Like, and I noticed, I think in some ways, like, you become not as good at your job, even for me, at least, because it's like the mask becomes harder and harder to put on, and so like I'm preaching, it's like my preaching's not even very good because I'm not fully invested in what these people want. And then it's like there's this odd moment where like I'm going to have to convince these folks that they're wrong before they're going to listen to me. And that's really never goes well for, most, folks. I remember being in a conversation with a guy, and he was one of those like really into Ravi Zacharias people.
Oh, yeah.
Like just, a very like really wanting to be Ravi Zacharias. And I'm like, the amount of work I'm going to have to do to prove to this guy he's wrong, because it's like, it's not hard for me to do, but it's like, it's just not worth it at a certain point where it's like one of us is going to have to break, and it's likely probably going to end up being me. And it's just, that's not good. And so I feel very much where you're coming from. That story very much resonates. But also it's like, it becomes this odd push-pull where you're like, I want to open this book up that I am passionate about, that I know a lot about. I feel like spirituality can be more, but where I'm at is just, they say bloom where you're planted, but it's like, I actually can't bloom where I'm planted right now because they are actively against blooming.
Right.
So you're in this tension, like where does it go? Do you kind of play the game for a long time, or is it I gotta go, or is it I'm fired? Like how does this story play out?
Yeah, there was a change of pastors around the time all this was going on, and I got to that point where I said I can stick around for another 10 plus years before this guy is ready to hand over the church to someone else, and there's no guarantee it's going to be me. And even if it is, you can't take a faith community, flip a switch, and say, now do things my way. Like how long would I have to work to get us back to where we were before he was there? Because he was trying to take it back in a fundamentalist direction. So how long do we have to take to get out of that before we can even get anywhere remotely near where I want to be? And I think it really hit for me when we always had the tracts you would pass out. We were good Baptists. And it got to a point where I said, man, I have not been willing to pass out a single one because I didn't want people to hear what I knew they would probably hear in the service. And that's
Mhm.
where I hit the point of saying, okay, something's wrong here. I can't keep living this way.
That's really bold. And then you just left. Like, to me, that's bananas. Like, most people would sit with that for a little while. Like, you came to a logical conclusion and you're like, and I'm out. Like, what
Well,
was that like? It feels like there's got to be more to that story.
there is. And this is where the aspect of spiritual abuse comes in. And this is really close to my heart. Like, every January is considered to be Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. So we take time on our podcast to focus on that, do some talks with people about it, because that's something that I experienced at that church, where there was a staff member, hardest working person you'll ever know in your life, nicest person when he's trying to get you into the church. But the second you're either in the door and now he can focus on someone else, or you've made clear you don't want to be in the door, then he starts to become a bit of an a-hole. And so all of this had happened where, like, when I was a kid, we had a revolving door of youth pastors. And it always was painted as, oh, those guys weren't faithful. They didn't know how to be committed. And then one day I sat down, I was like, so all these people left and one person stayed. There's a pattern here. Maybe there's a reason. My family was heavily involved in the church. My mom was a secretary. My dad headed up the ushers. He had been a cop for his whole life, so he was head of security there. Yeah, all this stuff. And they had seen stuff. I was friends with youth pastors who had seen stuff. So I realized this guy is being manipulative. He has lied. He has changed stories around. And I had voiced the concern, along with some other people had as well, and didn't feel it was handled well. So when the new pastor came in and I had mentioned it was still just not really being taken care of. So when I realized we were going to leave, all the people who had left before left quietly, which I'm sure plenty of your listeners know the meaning there of, like, we don't talk about this. Right? God's leading us somewhere else.
We don't talk about, what was his name?
Right, right, yeah, exactly.
We don't talk about Bruno and all the other youth pastors and anyone
so
else
I
that
said,
abruptly left.
I'm not going to do that. And I told people, oh yeah, I'm leaving for, this reason. Oh, and this pastor is spiritually abusive. The pastor and deacons did not like that at all. So I got called into a meeting about it, told a day and a half before that I was going to be in this meeting. And I, in that time, contacted the former staff members. I got 17, this is how much of a nerd and how OCD I am. I got 17 pages of definitions of spiritual abuse and 8 pages of testimonies from former staff members about this guy. And I lined them up. I made copies for each of the deacons of the pastor.
You're like, I brought some receipts. some receipts.
And at that point, I was told I was being divisive, letting the devil get a foothold, rebellious, disrespectful, yada, yada. And the real breaking point in the conversation came when one of the deacons said, well, Colin, if we know they said, we know there are these issues and we think we've handled them. I'm like, no, you haven't handled them well. You may have handled them, but not well. And he said, well, if we got rid of him, we would lose good tithers. And I said, oh, okay. I thought we were supposed to be running a church, not a business, but yeah, kind of went downhill from there.
Yeah.
That's always an interesting thing to me is when people say, because that is something that I used to hear all the time. It's like, well, we can't address this thing because these people who give a lot of money might leave. And my thought was always, but what about the people who gave money that left? Like,
yes.
If you don't address the problem, then the problem just gets, you know what I'm saying? Like, it just feels like such a weird thing to say.
And I will say this too. Every person that has ever threatened to leave eventually has left. Like, so like caving into people that are like, oh, if you fire this person or if you take this theological position, whatever it happens to be, or we'll leave. They're eventually going to leave. No matter what. Like that happened to me in my position. There was several people that were like, hey, this guy is LGBTQIA affirming. We can't have this in our church. It's him or us. All of those people have since left the church after getting what they wanted, which was me. So it's an odd kind of thing where you'll never satisfy someone in a spiritual community that's throwing their monetary weight around.
Right.
That's just, they'll never be satisfied, or they're just kind of looking for an excuse already. And you don't want to be like flippant where you're like, well, see you then. But I honestly, that's maybe the more healthy thing to do for a community. But again, I'm not a pastor now, so it's easy for me to just say no to money.
To ask you both, since you have both been pastors, what do you think would be some red flags that church members should look for, like when they're visiting a church or a part of a church, that might indicate there's some spiritual abuse going on here that could be a problem?
Yeah. There's a couple things that I think my body notices first. And that is this notion that you can't ask questions. And I also, it's funny, whether I realize it or not, I always notice how many men are upfront or not upfront. I
Mm.
notice diversity in spaces, but whenever there is not an allowance of questioning of things and the other thing that I have experienced is people who really want to be celebrated in a way. How do I put this? You're asking for a level of respect that doesn't make sense for someone you don't know. So what I mean by that is we had a visiting pastor one time who like wanted to make sure that they have a good parking spot on Sunday and things like that. And it was like, to me, that was just like but we don't know you yet. Like, even like people would call me pastor once I was their pastor. I didn't demand that they call me that. I got my reverend when I was, younger, I guess. And I still didn't demand that until people were really ready to call me that. So anytime I feel like there is a level of unearned authoritarianism, respect stuff, that always, if you can't question someone and if they demand that you call them a certain thing, I don't know. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I echo all of those. I think if someone's like getting invited to a community, what are you being invited to? Like, in the sense of kind of what Sarah was saying, if most of the invitation to come to a church is our pastor this, our pastor that, we have a church
Yeah.
that has a pastor that, it's not always, but very likely a situation where there is a certain cult of celebrity happening. And
Personality driven.
yeah, and here's the thing, like,
I've been accused of that before, but yes.
but I will say this too: a personality-driven organization is not automatically corrupt or abusive. Like,
Okay.
there are some, but I will say that it's kind of like a dictatorship. Truly, like a dictatorship is an incredibly efficient form of governance. Like,
Yeah.
like, and if there is a good person in place, then it's probably maybe quote unquote the best. Like, now, caveats and stars in place, just so
Right.
everyone's aware. I'm not advocating for that, because two things happen. One, power just tends to corrupt and go to people's heads. And also, it's not a sustainable system, because once the quote good person leaves, there's all these structures in place that a bad person can just take advantage of. So I feel like a cult of personality is something to look at and go like, this person had better be incredibly just ethical on their own, and also have in the background a lot of structures in place to keep them in check. Because what will happen a lot of times is, in those systems, people will start covering for that person, and they like, it's what I'm trying to say is, like, it's not automatically a red flag, but it is something to go like, there could be something going on here when everything is directed at the pastor. We have a pastor that the pastor might not even be doing it on purpose, but the community is structured in such a way that we worship this person, and we'll cover for this person, and we'll do anything for this person. And it's like, that's where it's like, no.
Yeah, when they talk about the person more than like my community that believes this, and then the pastor is then mentioned, that feels like a healthier, like, oh, I go to this really like cool community. I'm thinking about like my friend's church that I would actually consider going if I lived anywhere near. But the way he describes it is, we have this really like open community, and then like, I swear to you, it's going to be like 3 sentences before he even gets to it. And our pastor's like really awesome, and make sure that the space is, open for all kinds of people. But yeah, I think that's a sign for me, is like you say, that's everything's about this pastor, and they're demanding a certain sort of respect that feels like unearned.
Yeah, I think another thing to look at is, and you're not going to get a straight answer, because a lot of people don't know, but like, what does this church exist to do? Or what does this community exist to do? Like, I mean, if they are using the word biblical more than once, I mean, these are all just like, they're cautionary things, because people, you can be biblical, I guess, and when like, we stand for the Bible. We want the world to be a more biblical place. We're biblical this, biblical that. It's like, okay, this is about celebrating this book and not
and
about the
about pushing
people.
your particular views of that
Yes.
book
Yeah, and
on
in
others.
particular, you know, if like if we're gonna dig in, what does biblical even mean? It probably means like Republican Party talking points.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just more like, what is this? Is it oh, we exist, like we want to serve our community. We are here to make sure that the people that are coming here feel welcome and they feel like this is a safe place for them to be. And we want to make sure not just our community, but the surrounding community, people we don't even know, that we are a benefit to this place that we're placed in. I think those are just two different, like, do we exist to like change the world to look more like us, or do we exist to make the world a better place? I think those are different postures that, again, and I can think of caveats and like exceptions to where like, well, maybe one might not be, and maybe one would be abusive in whatever way. But it's like, I think these are things to kind of start looking for. Also, even just the website. You can look at a website and be like, all right, it's all old white men, and they talk about the theological statement and this and that and the other. Like, that's what's in the front, versus like, this is all pictures of the people that come here. And we also have very clear statements on who's welcome and like, and why they're welcome. Particularly, I'm thinking of mostly like LGBTQIA folks, but also just like, what kind of people are welcome here, what aren't. And I will respect a community, frankly, that is not affirming, that like with their full chest says it on their website. Like, I will actually respect that. I wouldn't go there myself. I wouldn't give them my money. I would steer people clear, but I at least appreciate that, versus wishy-washy statements of like, everyone's welcome.
Side note.
You know, with and so it's like, are they very clear about this is not just everyone's welcome, but like everyone, and this is exactly what we mean by everyone, and we're fully affirming or not affirming. I think those are big indicators, important things that will clue you in that the likelihood of safety, you know, and you can't guarantee it, but it's like, this is more likely to be a place that's not going to be abusive versus some place that's like, this is going to be rough.
Yeah, I would say another thing for spiritual abuse is, I don't know how to put this. I'm just going to put it in the way that it seems like would be it's this spiritual gaslighting. So the idea that like you have this everything is sort of like, you're meant to do this thing. And you're like, I don't know. I don't know what I feel about it. It's like, oh, no. Like, this is what you're supposed to do. This is who you're supposed to be. And anytime you bring up anything opposing that, then you're letting in the wrong belief system or the wrong thoughts. Like, when you were speaking about being told like, oh, you're letting the devil in, or whatever it might be, that really is not allowing you to learn how to trust your own inner voice and inner knowing. And so it's like always relying on this spiritual knowing that somehow is going to be separate from what you feel like in the depths of yourself is really what's going on. And I think a lot of spiritual abuse looks like not helping people tap into their own intuition. And it's really thinking that everything goes through a funnel of what the divine would think. But mind you, they're telling you what the divine thinks. So not your own ability to tap into your connection to the divine. It's all about like, well, this is, there used to be a woman who would always tell me what God told her about me and what my next step was. And it was kind of intoxicating, right? It was a little bit like having a psychic or something around you all the time.
Personal prophet.
Yeah.
And it felt really safe and really good because God was telling her great things. And some of those things would come true. So then you're like, okay, well, but what I realized, it was never like, well, what? Wouldn't God tell me that? Wouldn't I sense that this is where I'm supposed to be? Like, it just very much, the only word I can think about of it is a little bit of spiritual abuse, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's spiritual gifts language starts to, I'll just be honest, spiritual gifts get abusive real fast because
I agree.
Like, well, because like, to your point, Sarah, this person might be thinking, well, I have the gift of prophecy and maybe you don't. So that's why God speaks to me and not to you. or like, well, I have, whatever gift, the gift of earning money. So like I can earn money and I get to tell the church what to do financially because that's my gift. Or I have the gift of preaching and teaching, and only men can have the gift of preaching and teaching. So I think it's that role-based language, or that like, we have to have everything in this line. Again, most of mine have been things that like before you even walk in the door, but even when you're in the door, like, does this place seem like it trusts the people that are in it? Does this place seem like a place that has avenues to power that don't require some kind of financial or monetary commitment, in a sense of like, like membership requirements, like, okay, we're going to have all these stringent things placed on members, or even like membership as a concept is kind of an odd thing anyway, but I get that why churches still do it. But it's like, how much am I being required to open myself up versus how much is this community benefiting me and giving back to me? And if it's like, okay, it's give, open up, be vulnerable, but you still don't get access. That's, to me, an environment that's going to have people give up so much of that power or just their personal autonomy to gain really not a lot in return other than more jobs to do or more expectations. And I do want to say, though, when it comes to spiritual abuse, I think there are definitely psychotic people that do a lot of this intentionally. So, but I think maybe even, I'm not going to put a percentage on it, but I'm going to say maybe the majority by...
You were tempted, though. I
was
saw
like,
your brain.
I was
Like, you were about to give a percentage.
I was like, no, I will say the majority, more than 51%, is just systems based.
Yeah.
We have core systems in fundamentalism, in evangelicalism to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And we have poor understandings of theology that like that kind of allow people to fall into these buckets of like, you should just serve the church. You should be giving yourself up to this place because that's what God wants you to do. And I don't know that anyone's like masterminding it. It just happens incidentally. And that part really sucks because there's not like a person to blame necessarily. Right. It's just like you're part of a system and I was part of a system and we were both really faithful soldiers in this system. And I got really hurt because of it, because you happen to have more power than me. And you're being hurt by the person that has more power than you. And that's just kind of what you learned how to do. And so that's where it becomes hard, because we want to have this like personal enemy.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that can exist, but it's also like they're just doing what they thought was right. And that's also what makes it harder to fight, because you're like, yeah, let's get the bad person out. If we put a good person in a bad system, it's not going to change that much.
Yeah.
And like when Sarah mentioned seeing what kind of people are on the stage or on the platform, it reminded me of I went to college in North Carolina. It was Bible Belt South in the mountains. And the church we went to, it was not intentionally an all-white church, but it was an all-white church.
Right.
But on the tracks, the invite cards, whatever you want to call them, the pastor had made sure they had diverse pictures. Like he made sure there were black people on there, Asian on there. But you walk in the church and you look around, it's like, where are they? It's just stock footage.
Yeah.
And it even made me think, like the church I came from, if you walked in the door, it was a very diverse congregation. But if you look at leadership, it was all white men. Now, there were 2 black guys that were deacons, but it was kind of, I hate to say token in a way. It was like, look, that we're not an all white leadership. Oh, and we were very progressive. We had a female choir director. So that's about as far as we went, right?
Talk about a foothold for the devil.
Before we mention anything else, because I'm going to forget this, when I first asked the question, Sarah, you said something, it was just a throwaway line. We never even chased it down. You said one of the biggest red flags for you is just what you feel physically.
Yeah, I think again, it's that having fought so hard to claim an intuition, a bodily intuition, learning to trust that feeling you get when you're in a space and you're like, everyone else seems to be okay. Like, I have an example of this church that I went to with an ex-boyfriend of mine, and he was just so excited to go to this church. And I looked at him and I was like, everyone is cool looking. Everyone is like, everyone looks so hip. There's something not right. And I know that sounds funny, but my body felt like, if I stay here, I'm going to be asked to be like this, or I'm going to feel like I don't fit in if I'm not like this. And it was like something that my body noticed when I walked in the room, and I was very uncomfortable. And we went to that church for a while, and it was a very uncomfortable place for me because it felt like there was this real thrust for everyone to be in line and similar and like cool and hip. And it's interesting because that church really does have a look to it. And for me, I don't know how, without some sort of manipulation, how does that happen? And whether that's intentional or not, yeah. Yeah. So I think learning to trust how our bodies feel when someone starts talking about something or when we're in the space, I think we have to kind of learn how to do that when we haven't learned how to do that.
Yeah. I can
When we
think
weren't
of
taught
so
that.
many people. Yeah, I think of so many people, women especially, but some men too, that are faithful church attenders and would deal with frequent panic attacks in church. And, I'm not your therapist, so I wasn't going to say anything in this situation, but I'm just sitting there thinking, there might be a reason you keep having it in the same location.
Right. And I think
and
hearing yourself.
It's not the devil or something necessarily, like maybe something devilish happened, but we've been taught to ignore that for some greater good, and now we're in our 30s and 40s, some of us, like, how do I know what I want?
Yeah.
Because it just gets pulled right out of you. I think this is a good spot.
We're going to take a break?
To take a break. And when we come back, we'll just keep this discussion rolling because it's a good time.
Friends, thank you for joining us back. Colin, do you have any other questions around this other than how to notice it?
I do. And this is actually something I was just talking with a friend about. I'd love to pose this to you all and see where it goes. I know a guy who was a pastor had an issue of abuse that was brought up that he mentioned, and it wasn't handled well. He's not a pastor anymore. And I've been talking with him about, missing the community that you had in church. And he's like, oh, well, what if we got a group of friends together and had like a house church? But then how long is it until you start playing music on your Echo beforehand? And then someone goes, oh, that sounds good. I like to sing. Can I sing this song I like before that? And then how long before someone has an issue and you start passing around an offering for them? And then you need more people in there so you get a bigger building. And you've basically created a church again, the same way that we had before.
Yeah.
And it's like a couple of steps. By the time you're one generation past, you're back at the starting point. You have just as many issues that could happen as before. Like, there's a part of me that wonders if Christianity can survive beyond the first generation and be pure. Because the second it starts to spread and get big, like, Christianity is a minority movement. And once it gets power, it stops being what it was about. Is there any way, and you both have been pastors, you both have a podcast talking to people in these spaces, how can we, whether inside a church or outside of it, doing things like this, how can we start to create a Christianity that changes the system so it's not so susceptible to spiritual abuse?
I actually think it's a great question because what happens, how do we move beyond this, the church is in power? Because the huge false narrative right now is that in any way the church is oppressed. I mean, Justin's face says it all. You hear it everywhere, right? Like, they're not letting us do this or what? Like, the church is in no way oppressed in America. I don't know how to say that any clearer.
Loss of privilege is not the same thing as persecution.
Yes, say it. So I think we're already at that point where the church as it exists right now, especially here in the West, it is not similar to a group of people gathering, towards a common good or, that kind of thing necessarily. Now, there are some really well-meaning, beautiful, lovely spaces. I think that is happening. But what do you do when what the church looks like for folks, especially folks on the outside? It really doesn't in any way resemble the gathered community, the ecclesia. Like like, what do you think, Justin? Like, can we ever go back?
I think it's a lot more. I feel like the conversation has to be very nuanced and targeted because I'm thinking like several layers at once, and hopefully some of this makes sense. I think first off, we have to kind of address the very white elephant in the room, which is that, like, I think a lot of the problems, at least in the American church, are really the white American church.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
a
yes,
lot
yes.
of white American evangelicals are like, you can't be a Christian and vote Democrat. Well, a lot of Black Baptists, you know, you're basically saying their faith is somehow not as valid or as real.
Right. Yeah.
And so, like, okay, so that's a piece of it there. I think for the last, I don't know, 1800 years since Constantine, following Christ and the structure of a church have been confused to be the same thing.
Mm.
And I think we have to disentangle those things, which, again, they've been entangled for at least 1800 years, if not longer. So good luck doing that in a year or an afternoon. And so I think it's like, okay, and also I think that white people in this country generally, maybe even in the West, have very little distress tolerance. So when it comes to, like, the second I feel a little bit of stress, I'm oppressed. This is just like the Jews in Nazi Germany. Like, and that's like
it's wild. We've heard these
quote.
things.
It's like a quote. That's not an exaggeration. That's a quote. You know, and it's like, okay, so, like, we have to work on white folks having distress tolerance generally before we can even have these conversations about, like, just changing spirituality, before we can have this conversation about the fact that, like, following Jesus, if that's what you're interested in doing, has nothing to do with most of what we associate that to be with in the United States. Like, gathering in this building, singing these songs. I mean, we've transported Jesus ahead 2,000 years.
He'd be like, the fuck is this?
Yeah, like, first off, he's screaming in Arabic. Like, what happened? You know? But we have to be willing to admit that what we do today is alien and foreign to what Christianity was originally idealized to be. And so, like, do we even need to get back to that? And then, like, what are we headed? So I think there are just so many conversations we have to have. And I think that's the problem why a lot of these particularly progressive Christian spaces do end up falling apart in a few years.
Right.
Because it's like, okay, we shifted our theology to being less problematic. Great. But we're still very much married to this idea that we have to have this structure, you know, these things in place, this kind of cultural inertia that's just really hard to get over. And Sarah and I both, we've been in enough of these spaces where it's like, yeah, okay, you're accepting of queer people, and I'm sure that was a real big jump for you, straight white man, but, like, you're still at the top. You're still inviting these people to participate, but you're not including them in leadership. And is this functionally any different? And a lot of times the answer is no. And a lot of times, you know, these spaces, and I've been in the deconstruction space for a while now. I've been a nominal leader in this. I don't even know what you call it. It's just like someone who is like, if Evangelical is like already D-list internet celebrities, I feel like I'm a D-list celebrity even in there. But it's just like, okay, it's like I've been around here enough, and I've talked to enough people, and I have enough, you know, relationships to be like, we continue to recreate these same problems a lot of times. And so I think it goes deeper than just I'm changing my theology, or I'm changing my approach to God, or I'm changing, you know, the team that I'm on. I think fundamentalism and a lack of distress tolerance runs a lot deeper. It's in our nervous system. It's not in our cognition. And so I think there's so many things that we have to disentangle that it's hard for me to even know how to describe an answer other than to say, this is a, you know, big problem that if we are not very aware of walking into it, yeah, you're just going to keep banging your head against the same wall.
Can I say something that shocks me, even that I would think this, but I've been having this like weird little hum that, like, things are really rough. Things are, particularly for those of us who lean more progressive, like, it's a scary time. It's getting scarier. I work in homeless intervention and prevention and education, and it's scary. It's absolutely scary. And there's part of me that wonders, will the church show up when it's actually needed in this? Like, will all the other bull become really, really clear? I don't think it's too much to say. Think about Nazi Germany and the Bonhoeffers that show, right? Will church be church because people are going to need it? And I don't know the answer to that, but it is interesting that part of me has this sort of like, this is a big, interesting potential time for churches that I know that are kind of badass, but might show up in a way that it could be interesting. I don't know if either of you have thought that way, but like, oh, those little tiny churches that have become these like I think about all the cultural movements that have happened in the past, particularly here in the West. Church has been like significantly part of helping move things forward. What is that going to look like? Because it's definitely been part of moving it backward. And so, what is there a potential for the church to show
Yeah.
up?
I think it's interesting because the church has a lot of power culturally,
Yeah.
and it kind of like back to what I've talked about like near the beginning of this podcast, like that can be used for a great good,
Mhm.
this just the massive amounts of cultural power that we just hand the church. But we're seeing that, yeah, it's really easy, like lightning fast. I mean, this podcast, we kind of joke, the theme for most people's journeys is either the year 2016 or the year 2020.
Oh my gosh, seriously.
Or a little bit of
True.
both. And probably 2024 will also feature heavily. And, there's people like, oh, you base your faith around the election. Like, no, but these are inflection points where we realize, like, I realized very quickly as Donald Trump was being elected, like, oh, we're now shaping our theology to back up this person. Our politics is shaping our theology, our view of the Bible more rapidly than I was ever prepared for. Over the period of a summer in 2016, suddenly now so much theology was thrown out and so much new theology took its place. I kind of felt like over the course of a few months. And I remember being just shocked. Like I was just unprepared for that. And so that's where it's like, I feel like the system does need to be dismantled in a lot of ways. At the same time, though, there is this temptation to be like, if you got enough people on board, you could swing a lot of that power the right way. It's such a double-edged sword too, because it's so easy to just jump back.
Yeah, I don't know. At least where I'm at right now, I've just kind of had this thought that everything Jesus preached was grassroots. And the minute the church starts to accumulate power, I mean, heck, by the second generation of the church, just look at Paul's letters, or whoever may have written them, but the epistles that we have. There's all the issues of spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, physical abuse, and all of that. And he's dealing with all these things. He's dealing with people who have cults of personality and saying, I'm all about this guy or that. Like, it goes back to the very beginning. The second it stops being just a small community together trying to help their community, and instead of let's spread the good news of how we can help the world, it becomes let's turn the world into being us. A bunch of little mini-me's running around. Like it totally changes the mission of the church from, let's be a help in the community to let's turn the community into a part of us.
Yeah. I don't know how that changes. Like beautiful things have also come out of it, even though some really terrible things. I think about a lot of the leaders that we look up to that actually were okay people. A lot of them have some sort of faith background. So it's an interesting conversation sometimes to think about what could people under pressure, what could be a helpful way the church could show up, and will it?
Maybe then there's no movement that can save this. Maybe it's what we're doing here. It's when you in your own life realize something needs to change and you start to make those steps forward. Like it inches Christianity as a whole to where it needs to be. It's not something where we're going to flip the switch. What are you saying? The Constantine, 1800 years of church. It's not going to change. Right. It's not going to change completely in our lifetimes, but what we can do is just try to make it a little better for the next generation by having these honest conversations and trying to be a little bit better each time.
Yeah. Like you said, kind of look at how do we play in this? How am I involved in this? How can I be helpful? And like looking at our own selves. But yeah, you're right. And then we gather with people and then we make rules. Like we really do have, we seem to have a problem not creating structure around things.
I wanted to make sure I asked you guys at least this one other thing here is just in your own process of all of this. Has there been any particular resources or practices that you personally have found helpful or healing since leaving the pastoring circles that you had been in?
Yeah.
I think Sarah mentioned it earlier. I think reconnecting with my body, my physicality, and I think too, in the time that I'm in now, or in the time that we find ourselves in now, kind of reconnecting to our locality. And I know that's
Mm.
on a lot of buzzwords, but I think there is a temptation to become very disembodied in faith spaces. I think to become very just in our heads, right thinking, right speaking, rather than like being. And I think too, with the internet, where we would just want to be out and spread out versus getting to know our actual neighbor.
Mm.
And I think too, like with politics, there's this, like what is going on way, way, way far above me versus like what is happening down the street at the school board or the town council. I think personally for me, because it's overwhelming, like our brains just can't hold it. And my brain can't barely hold the concept of God, frankly, or in a way that's healthy, that doesn't like
Yeah.
make me want to like have power over people. So it's like,
I love hearing
like
that
it's
honesty.
just
Yeah.
human problem. So it's like, I think
Yeah.
taking a step back and being like, okay, what can I do for my body today? Or what can I do for my neighbor today? And also I think the last piece of that is getting to a place where that is enough. I've done enough if I've taken care of myself, and I've taken care, and in having a healthy person have made some other people a little more healthy around me. That's enough. I don't have to have things figured out on a cosmic scale or a federal scale, or unless that's my job. And for most of us, it's not. And so it's like, I think kind of taking that step back is something that has helped me immensely, for sure. It's not easy because my ego just wants more attention and more responsibility. It's like, let's back off a little second, buddy.
It's good.
Yeah, I love that idea of getting really local. I think noticing the connections that I have to people, you were saying community is what people miss a lot. It's funny that you said get to know your neighbor. Today, like I said, I was scrambling to move everything I have off of my patio with 2 days' notice. The people are coming to work on our stucco. And my neighbors, who are this incredible queer couple, he actually grew up pretty evangelical Christian, and his partner had been to a youth group, and we have these incredible conversations. And one time he's like, I know who you are, actually. But we have like we've just bonded, and like my hose broke and they went and bought me a new one without like even like
Oh, nice.
just the kindest people, and had to help me take apart this big patio furniture. And uh, as he was leaving, one of my neighbors said, it was fun to be together today. And I think those are the moments that I really want to notice, because I think they are my connection. My connection to the divine, or my connection to God, for me really is in those magical moments between people. That always was my favorite part about being a pastor. And I find that those connections really, really matter to me. And I'm built for deep relationship. And when I experience that, it feels nothing less than sacred. And I've had a couple of really incredible experiences lately of people like just connecting on that level. And so that feels really grounding and connecting for me. But also, I think learning to be present in my own body in places and spaces is something that for me, I have just learned over the last couple of years. So through embodiment, and what does that mean and look like? I actually just talked on a podcast about this, but like actually learning to ask myself, like, hey, do I like doing what I'm doing right now? Where am I here? Because part of my past was learning how to disassociate and disappear. Like I'd still be somewhere, but my brain was outside of my body. And I think learning to connect those two and be present, and then ask myself, do I want to do something, or do I want to be in a place? What do I, what is actually going on for me? And that feels like noticing, again, noticing the divine. And that's been really connecting for me. Even going to like events like we were at Theology Beer Camp and things like that, that feels like a return to myself in some ways, and doing that and feeling comfortable in those spaces. So yeah, or uncomfortable and wanting to bring up why, and all those sort of things, is those for me have been really powerful ways of connection. And I also realized the other day that I have a quiet time every day, and I laugh at this because I It's not what it used to be. My dog and I go on really, really long walks ever since the pandemic. And I now work later. I start work at 9, which I'm someone who wakes up at 6. So I will take my dog, and the coffee shop that I love doesn't open until 7. So we go on these pretty long walks. And I realized, because I missed it when I was traveling to see my family, and so I didn't have my dog. So it's like taking my brother's dog on these long walks. But there's something for me about that time. And sometimes I'm listening to a podcast, sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm just, what's interesting though, as someone who has ADHD, I literally have my earphones in, but I'm not listening to anything. Do you do that, Justin, or is it just me?
Yeah, I've done that before. Or I'll have them in listening to something and I'll turn it off. And then it'll be like, oh,
Yeah.
my ears. Like, oh, this has been in my ear for like an hour and a half. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. For no reason. So yeah, I think that to me also feels like really sacred space, is just those long walks where I don't know, I just watching, like following him wherever he wants to go. Yeah, those are my places and spaces.
Yeah.
And I love the little story of, that time with your neighbors there, because with how I was raised in the church, that needed to be a witnessing opportunity. It needed to be something where we're trying to get them in church or get them to be saved, or especially stop being queer in that instance, But just to have a space where there is no agenda other than cleaning your porch, so that where I'm not there to get you into my belief system. I am just there to be there with you.
And I realized we were equally vulnerable.
Isn't it like it's like it's a relief to not have to be God's salesman anymore. Like just constantly.
And isn't that what church is supposed to be, though? Is just our reconnecting humanity and sharing a little piece of heaven with each other. Like that is being church without having to evangelize. So I love that.
I love that, the idea of, because I think it takes us a while to figure out we can have relationships without agenda. Like, do you guys remember when you started making friends outside of the church? Like, for me, it was after I was no longer a church planner. So not only did I have like the church, but I was a pastor of a redeveloping church space. So I was like the ultimate, every relationship had an agenda. And if it wasn't that I wanted you to join my church, it was like, how could it benefit the church? Not totally, but it felt like I felt guilty for those times I wasn't doing that.
Yeah, if you missed an opportunity to, if you quote missed an opportunity to witness or fundraise or whatever, like you felt guilty afterwards because it was like, I missed a divine appointment or something. And it's like, it's this exercise of missing what's in front of you all of the time. Like, because you have to have some other thing going on. And I feel like there's so many problems with teaching people that to be present for another person and to be present with yourself is somehow failing God or failing the church. And it's like, no, I actually think if we could help and resource people to be content with themselves, that to me is the revolution, truly. And to be like not reactive when you see something or you see a person that is different than you. That's a spiritual discipline that I think needs to be taught more, and less like everything has to be about selling Jesus. It's like, okay, that's not worked out well.
And you probably felt like, I felt weird. I don't know. I felt weird. It was always a weird, like, hey, do you want to check out? It always felt like a weird sales.
Yeah, so it's just, that's not how you talk about anything else with anyone else. If you have, I don't know, an amazing kitchen appliance, you don't go around telling everybody about that unless you know they need that new appliance.
Yeah.
It's weird the way we start acting not normal when we think that every little interaction has to be about getting you to be exactly like me.
Yeah. So there it is. We figured it out, guys.
We did it.
Right.
Look at that.
Once again, we've solved all of the world's problems.
Yeah,
that's amazing. I didn't think we could do that in an hour. So it was you two. That's why I needed on here.
We did it.
And next Sunday we'll gather together. Justin will do the opening hymn.
Yeah, and we'll discuss what we discussed here today and how to apply it to our lives.
I love it.
Do I at least get a good parking space in the front?
Yes, obviously.
Yes, clearly
you're
the three of us.
Pastor boy. Don't you remember that you're pastor boy?
Actually, see, at our church, you can be a pastor.
Yeah. That's the thing.
Look at
Yeah,
that.
yeah. You're
We're
good.
already doing it.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you. Colin, where can folks find your work and connect with you? How best can they stay in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having us on. I loved hearing your insight with this. So, our podcast, The Bible Uncut and Unfiltered, it's on any podcast platform. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok and YouTube. So, on all of those there, we just started up a Discord server recently as well, and we have the links to that all on our webpage, thebibleuncut.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Colin. Justin, any last thoughts? Not forever, but like just for this episode.
No, I'm doing good. I'm gonna pile of sentient stardust myself on out of here.
Does that mean you're tired?
No, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good today.
Gonna turn into a pile of sentient stardust.
I know, it turned into a verb. I like that.
I'm already there.
I love it. You guys, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.